Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Astrology Hub Podcast. This is our flagship show where we feature up-and-coming astrologers, as well as living legends in the field, and connect you with experts and thought leaders in fields related to astrology, demonstrating how astrology can support you in so many different areas of your life. Today, I am thrilled to be here with Barbara Hand Clow. We're going to be talking about astrology and the rising of Kundalini. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Amanda Walsh. I'm the founder of Astrology Hub, and I'm going to give you a little bit more background on Barbara before we dive into our topic. So Barbara is an internationally acclaimed astrologer, truly a living legend in the field. She's a ceremonial teacher, an author, a Mayan elder who is also part Cherokee. She's taught at sacred sites throughout the world, and Barbara's numerous books include titles like The Mayan Code, The Pleiadian Agenda, Alchemy of Nine Dimensions, Catastrophobia, and Astrology and the Rising of Kundalini. If you'd like to learn more about Barbara, you can go back to episode number 301, where we talked about Neptune and Pisces and whether or not that is the elephant in the room here in 2021. It's a great episode. I highly recommend you check it out. And Barbara, welcome back to the Astrology Hub podcast. I'm so happy you're here.
Hi, Amanda. And I just love connecting with you in Hawaii.
I know, it feels so good.
It does, doesn't it, Hyde?
Yes, exactly. So Barbara, let's start with astrology and the rising of Kundalini. What inspired you to write this book? What were you seeing in your clients, and what really was the impetus behind it?
What really inspired me to write it is what happened to me when I had my own Uranus opposition, because what I've discovered and will discuss is that what triggers Kundalini rising in everybody to varying degrees is when Uranus comes to opposition to your birth location. And so, of course, when that happened to me, that was before I knew anything about any of this. And so while I was in graduate school in 1983 and having my Uranus opposition, I literally was shaking all the way through graduate school. It was like having an earthquake in my body.
Oh.
And I had already had a Kundalini rising when I was 5.5 years old. And so I'm pretty easy with Kundalini on the whole, probably more so than most people, not during my opposition. I mean, I think all of the people who were with me in graduate school think I must be a maniac. So I'm serious about that if anybody ever tunes into this. So then I went back, finished graduate school, and continued to practice as an astrologer. I was a working astrologer while in graduate school. And I started noticing that a whole lot of other people were having the same kind of symptoms when they were right at, and what's incredible about this paradigm that I've discovered, and by the way, it's been accepted very widely in astrology now, but nobody knows who invented it. It's typical. But what I discovered is the very day of these transits are actually the most intense level. That's how predictive this is. It's really amazing. So once I saw what was going on, and I was also a student of Jung while I was in graduate school, and also a student of therapy in general, and also watching spiritual emergency in our culture, which we were seeing a lot of because a lot of people were doing Eastern level meditation techniques when they were in their 20s and 30s, and they were deliberately triggering Kundalini. And because that was happening, some very, very good books that are referenced in my book about spiritual emergency came out. And the spiritual emergency issue is a huge deal because you can get wrecked by it, but you also can totally transform your life and your consciousness with it. So once I realized what a big deal this was, of course, I had to write about it. And by then I already had 4 or 5 books in print, so there's no problem like getting it published and stuff like that. So I decided to write it, and I did.
So Barbara, lots of questions just from that. So for people that don't know what Kundalini rising is,
Right.
What is that?
Well, what Kundalini rising is a theory that comes from Eastern spiritual traditions, and acupuncture is based on it. And most of us know that acupuncture could be extremely effective. And so Kundalini energy is subtle energy in our bodies. It's not really like electrical energy or magnetism, although it actually is quite electromagnetic. But at this point, we've come so far beyond Eastern traditions that now science is verifying what they said for at least the last 5,000 years. So it's a fact. Kundalini energy is a real thing. It remains coiled at the base of the spine in our bodies until we're actually ready to release it. And then what happens is right at midlife crisis with Uranus opposite Uranus, the old snake coil at the spine starts rising up the spine whether you like it or not.
Hmm.
And so it's a subtle form of energy. And then the other issue with Kundalini energy, it's very healthy. If you can handle the rising of the energy and the intensity of the energy, which is what this book is all about. And there are many, many techniques for doing that easily rather than having a crisis. If you can do that, you're going to be much, much more healthy and much more vital all the way through your life.
Hmm. Okay. So when you're talking about the Uranus opposition and the midlife crisis, this is a transit that happens in everybody's life
Yes.
around age, what, 40 to 43?
38 to 44, because
Okay.
Uranus is slightly elliptical. And so because there's that much of a differential, I put tables at the end of the book that where you can look up your year and month of birth, and then you can look to see when this actually happens to you, so that you get the exact timing.
Okay. So from age 38 to 44, approximately in there, for you, it might be a little bit different. Check the chart and check your chart
Yeah.
to know exactly the age range for you. But what you're saying is that there's a subtle energy that is laying dormant, so to speak,
Yes.
in our bodies, and that it gets activated and turned on. And if we know that that's happening and we know how to work with it, it can be an extraordinarily healthy, like what words would you say if you're actually working with the energy? It's
Rejuvenating.
Okay.
Rejuvenating. You were just going to say that it's very transformative. Things in your life that you've really kind of tried to avoid or haven't faced yet often come to the surface to a tremendous degree during midlife crisis, as many people know. So
Yeah.
it's a very potent force and a very positive force. It's just that it's so tricky that if you don't understand what's going on, it can be difficult. And
Right.
that's what
Okay.
the book is all about.
Right. So when you say it can be difficult, what have you seen? Like, what do you see when people have this happening in their lives? They don't know it's happening. What do they think is happening? And what do we normally see in their behavior at that time?
Well, we'll separate men and women, which I did a lot in this book, because men and women have different responses because they have different needs in general. And for women, if they don't know anything about what's going on, they think it's menopause and they think it's hot flashes, because it does create hot flashes. And of course, often it does correspond to the timing of menopause. And so what it'll do is it'll activate your whole nervous system. And then what happens in your body, and we'll go back to men in just a second, but what happens within your body is you have a whole chakra system. You have a root chakra where the Kundalini energy is coiled. The next chakra is the solar plexus chakra right in your gut. And that's where you deal with power issues and taking on your own power. Then the heart chakra is the opening of the heart, and the throat is being able to speak our truth. And third eye is being able to see on subtle levels. And then the crown chakra is fusion with spirit. And so most people have blockages in one or a couple of those chakras because of some kind of childhood trauma or even sometimes a past life complex. There's a lot of these complexes actually are very well resolved by doing past life regression under hypnosis.
Mm.
But at any rate, so for women, the issue is opening the heart for the most part, because women just are naturally doing that. And then as they come to midlife crisis, they open the heart quite powerfully. But then they tend to be stuck in the throat. The most common place for a woman to be stuck is going to be in her solar plexus over conflicts with power issues, and then in the throat, speaking her truth. And so that's usually the issue for the woman. For a man, the issue is opening the heart, because men have often been so suppressed in childhood and even still suppressed as adults by their jobs or even by their family structures. And so men have a pretty serious issue with opening the heart at midlife crisis. And That's when I first really decided to write this book no matter what, because a lot of my male clients were having symptoms of heart attacks. And I actually had to have quite a few of them check it out with a doctor to make sure that wasn't what was going on, because that could be so dangerous. And so for men, they need a lot of help at that point because the culture isn't going to help them. And so, number one, if their wife can understand what's going on, usually you can work it out pretty well. But otherwise, when a man is blocked from opening the heart, he may have issues with thinking it's his wife or something. It's very critical for the wife to understand this
Mm.
process. And then therapy is very helpful for men because that's where they can talk. They can't talk anyplace else except
Mm.
with their wives, usually in therapy, maybe a good friend.
Yeah, I loved it in the book when you talk about I don't know if it's a fictional character or if you actually had a client who the one that was obsessed with bikinis. What
Mm,
was
yeah,
I can't
yeah,
remember the name that you gave him, but it was really cute. But basically you were saying that because this energy was rising in him, he was starting to look outside the marriage and feeling like he needed to have an outlet for it,
that's
but
right.
that once he understood what was actually happening in his body and he and his wife understood what was happening, they actually could work through it together, and it created a huge opening for him, like he
Yeah,
was able.
and Bob is one of my favorite characters, but all of the characters, I cast them as characters because midlife crisis stories fascinate most people. Um, but Bob is a character, and I'm very fond of Bob, and we go through various stages with Bob in the book. And
Yeah.
one of the stages that often happens with men, as the energy starts to rise into the heart, what's happening for them is they've been holding a lot of energy in the root chakra and in the sacral chakra, in the lower chakra, because they learn as young men to create erections by holding a lot of energy in that part of the body because it's all based on blood flow. And so during midlife crisis, at least 50% of men have some problems with erectile dysfunction for a while that resolves itself very well and easily if they understand what's going on. But needless to say, that's a potential time bomb. Where if the man is struggling to open his heart and then he also starts having erectile dysfunction, it's very easy to conclude that another woman could solve the problem. So I've got a couple of characters in the book who go through that crisis, and it's very severe crisis, and yet they just do so well if they just understand the paradigm. You know.
So Barbara, do you see that when that understanding is enough, that understanding what's actually happening brings people from that place of feeling like there's a problem, and that
Mhm.
then they can actually start to work with it? Or are there actually like specific practices or things that you recommend when people are going through this
Yeah.
period?
Once people understand that they're dealing with energy rising and some of the issues of the chakras, then the book gives all kinds of advice about how to handle it from a physiological perspective. Like one of the best things you can do if you have any blockages or issues with it is acupuncture, because acupuncture rebalances all the energy in the body and it eases the flow up the spine. It kind of takes away a lot of stuff that can kind of block it. And then a certain amount of counseling is fabulous at midlife crisis because it is a crisis. And if you think about it, beyond that, people are starting to realize they're dealing with aging. Like one of the things going on with Bob, the man who loved bikinis, was he was having his first stages of dealing with an aging crisis. And that's always very difficult for all of us, you know. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and then what's happened with this book, Amanda, it's been out, let's see, since 1991. So it's been out, it's 30-year anniversary at this point.
Wow,
Because this
amazing.
edition that you have
Yeah.
is 2013. And by the way, if anybody gets interested in it, be sure and get this edition because this is a major revision in this book. Not only the tables are updated, but also as I kept on going as an astrologer, people started saying to me, that people started mastering the paradigm. And luckily, it's an easy one to master, isn't it? It's like once you understand the concept and you start experiencing it, unlike a lot of astrology, it's really pretty easy to understand it. But then people would say, well, what about Pluto square Pluto, for example?
Yes.
Because Pluto square Pluto comes to all of us sometime between age 36 and 64. And that's a real interesting thing because Pluto is even more elliptical.
Mm-hmm.
And so I decided to also add a chapter on some of the other major transits that occur at this time. And then I also added a chapter called the Global Shamanic Paradigm, because I started to realize that it's not just individuals who are going through midlife crisis. I think our whole culture is going through a midlife crisis at this point. And I think if we start to interpret what's happening with our culture, it makes it easier to start to realize that what's happening now is transformative. And anytime you go through a transformative process, it's always difficult. A lot of dark issues come up. And I think we're right in the middle of a gigantic midlife crisis. Don't you?
Oh, definitely. But Barbara, in terms of humanity, are there any timing indicators that would show you that we're experiencing a very similar kind of thing that we experience as individuals in the midlife crisis, but
Well,
like as humanity?
once I had a chance to read the book again, and I hadn't read it since I revised it in 2012, so it was kind of fun. And once I started reading it again, I started asking a lot of those same questions myself. And I started to realize that in the case of the issue that we're talking about today, Pluto is probably the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And yeah, what led me to that was I said to myself, well, let's see. What about the Pluto squares, which as I said are between 36 years old? We have it at age 36. People born from 1960 to 2010 have a very, very short Pluto square Pluto, and they usually get it before Uranus opposition. And then somebody born in 1910 um, it doesn't get their Pluto square Pluto until they're 60 years old. There's
Wow.
a profound difference there because Pluto causes the deepest level of transformation and change that we experience as humans. So then, of course, I went, well, then when did this happen before? This is what astrologers always do. We finally go, did we go through this before? And
Right.
so I went back and found the most amazing thing. And I don't know if you noticed it in the book. I was so amazed that I it's so prophetic on this one page that I even told my daughter to read it.
Mm.
But we had Pluto square Pluto in okay, the short cycle is just the short cycle of Pluto. It's when it's in the most fast moving part of its elliptical orbit. So the last time that we had Pluto in this close ellipse was 1720 to 1770. Did you
Mm.
notice that?
I did not.
I picked it out and I went, holy mackerel, I'd written that and I completely forgot that I said that. But of course, we all know what happened in 1776, don't we?
Right.
We had the American Revolution, right?
Right.
So we've had the same cycle that we had in 1720 through 1760. We've had that from, let's see, we've had that from 1960 through 2010.
Oh.
And then already by 2015, 2016, we get a second version of the American Revolution. And regardless of anybody's opinion about Donald Trump, and I just stay neutral on it, because politics is never the point, the patterns are the point.
Mm.
And Donald Trump basically has led and is still leading a second American Revolution.
Ooh.
Now, isn't that amazing?
Yes. Very fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, I know. I know.
So the
So
birth
that
of
would
something
explain
new.
that
If,
would explain,
yeah,
what,
if we take that last pattern, then there was the birth of something very new
yes,
after that whole period of time. So maybe we're on the precipice of that.
that's right. That's right. And it all had to do with the formations of the states and the various ways that the country drew together at that time. And at this point, we're having enormous battles over elections and state laws regarding, from vaccination to people voting. We're having a tremendous kind of revolution within the states,
Yes.
within the United States.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about Uranus. I love in the book the way that you set it up. It's almost like a trilogy within our own lives, right? There's 3 transits that really you detail in the book, including Uranus, Saturn, Uranus, Chiron, and Saturn. So all three of them having a role in this saga with our Kundalini energy. So can you talk about Saturn and Chiron and their role in this?
It actually has more to do with Saturn and Uranus, but you can ask a question about that afterwards.
Yeah.
There's two things to realize, and people can understand this immediately, which is you get your first, Uranus square Uranus. That is, Uranus comes to its square position to your birth Uranus when you're around 21. We all know what happens at 21. That's the entrance into adulthood, right? And then we have midlife crisis when Uranus opposes Uranus. And then we have the upper square, which is, I didn't calculate that for today, but it's halfway between. So where Saturn comes in is Saturn and Uranus are always working together. And it is turning out to be a huge deal, particularly this year because of these Saturn Uranus squares. So the way that works, which people can really easily understand, is it takes Saturn 2.5 years to go through a sign. And so every 3 times, it's 7 years. And it takes Uranus 7 years to go through a sign approximately. It's a little bit, it changes a little bit, but basically you've got a pattern going all the time of 3 Saturn patterns and then a square, which creates the pressure for revolution. And then Uranus is going into another sign. And so it's really fruitful to take a look at that. And it explains a lot about some of the tensions we're having this year.
Mm. So the tensions between the old and the new, freedom versus control. And so this is part of what's happening at that midlife crisis period too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this freedom versus control paradigm is one of the hardest things that we struggle with. And so then it ends up being very intense at Uranus opposition. So that's
And that's where you see the stereotype of the midlife crisis, where you go out and you get the red sports car and you have the divorce, and that's that square between, or that tension between the freedom versus the control.
Oh yeah. And then let's get women into the dialogue for a minute here, because so often the only thing anybody talks about is men. And what happens with women is extremely fascinating. And like everything with Uranus and Saturn, if you understand what's happening, it's about 100 times easier to handle it. And so what goes on for women at Uranus opposition is they really need to take their power. The energy in their heart has probably been much more open than men's hearts are generally. And so as they come to that point, they really need to be able to open the throat chakra and to speak their truth. And there's women tend to be such givers at the heart that they can't really break out of that and move it into the throat without having a tremendous amount of time alone. And so I actually had clients, I had described some of the women in the books who just, one woman walked out and called her husband a year and a half later to ask if she could come back.
Wow.
And she had 3 children when she was like more or less in her late 30s, and it was kind of entrapping. And that husband, he just stayed and waited, and he loved her so much that he understood that it was the only way she could do it. Isn't that amazing?
That
Yeah.
is amazing.
That's one of the most amazing stories of women that I had with clients. But a lot of those stories are similar. They're just your own version of it. And if the husband can understand and give his wife space, then things can work out. But of course, what does the husband do? The husband is threatened by maybe losing her. And like this husband with 3 children was very threatened by possibly losing her, of course. So then, of course, what can happen is a lot of couples have midlife crisis at the same time. And
Yes.
I have to say, I used to work in an astrological marital counseling clinic in my early years, and astrology is just fabulous for marital counseling, because what we do is we just put the 2 charts in front of the table and of each person, and we just start explaining to them what their energy field is. And gradually they start to wake up and realize that the stresses they're having aren't personal and they aren't deliberately caused. It's coming from energy. And that's where astrology, can be so wonderful. So I could almost say, and I have said, and this is unusual for me, that if men and women are going to have midlife, if men and women are the same age and therefore are going to have midlife crisis at relatively the same time, get a hold of this book.
Mm.
Because think about what happens. The man is insecure and feels like he's using his sexual potency and wondering if he needs to get a red sports car, which some do. My husband drove home with a gray Miata the very first day of his Uranus opposition. He just went out and bought it at the car lot, a
Oh
new
my
one
gosh.
too. And I went,
Wow.
oh wow! But I said, at least it's not red. That
Yes.
Dudley Moore 10 is a classic midlife
Yes.
book. That's a wonderful, wonderful movie. Um,
Yeah.
so there the husband and wife are, and the woman is just feeling like, if I don't get out of here, I'm going to kill myself or him. And it's
Right.
just such a volatile combination. And both people can use the guidance in this book to help each other go through this period because it only lasts about a year and a half to two.
Mm.
It's not
Well,
forever.
and then throw kids in the mix. I mean,
Oh,
especially with a
yeah,
lot of people having kids later too. So you have young kids
right.
that are demanding all this attention. The woman just needs time alone. He's
Yeah.
feeling insecure. I mean, it's a perfect storm.
Yeah, and I have to say, Amanda, also, for us, Jerry and me, when we were going through it, and we're different ages, so fortunately we didn't get it at the same time. This is actually more when I was going through it. What do you think my kids were? Teenagers.
Mm.
So teenagers are acting out because they get Saturn opposite Saturn at 14 to 15 years old.
Mm.
So this extra chapter in the book also gets into Saturn cycles, especially for kids. Because what I started finding is, boy, you take a husband and wife having midlife crisis at the same time, and the kids are teenagers, and this case, this is nuclear.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible.
And you say in the book that if you're in this period of time, that you recommend you don't get a divorce, even if you feel like you want to get a divorce, you don't get it until the end of the Uranus opposition.
Yeah, I've literally almost begged some clients, just wait. Even if they need to separate, I just say, don't go through all the financial, all the stuff that happens with the divorce is always so difficult. And quite a few of my clients listened and held it together
Mm.
better, and didn't get divorces, and were very, very grateful later on that they had not, because
Mm.
their partner. No, that's not always true. That the partner you have is the right one for you, and that's going to have to be resolved, of course. But this is a bad time to split up and separate.
Mm.
But
So,
some people,
Barbara, what if people listening feel like they went through this phase, they weren't aware of what was actually happening, they maybe made some messes in their life, or maybe not, but now they're on the other side of it. They're no longer in the Uranus opposition period. Is there another time in our lives that we can access this energy and use it for our health and well-being, or is that like a missed opportunity?
um, well, what you're really asking is, or the question you're really asking is, what happens if the Kundalini just gets blocked and doesn't rise at midlife crisis? And
Yes.
that can happen if the repressive attributes in your life are serious enough. Then the energy doesn't rise, and usually people have kind of a unpleasant and emotionally deep time in their 40s, and then Chiron return comes. And the third major transit involved in this transformation of our growth patterns, Saturn return, Uranus opposition, and Chiron return. The third transit is a spiritual crisis.
Mm.
So if someone has gone through Kundalini Rising and they've learned, maybe they start, a lot of people do yoga in their 40s because they want to, really take advantage of the energy and use it for health and enhancement and happiness. And so when they get to age 50, they do okay with the spiritual crisis. And in fact, they welcome it because it's an opportunity to make a breakthrough to spirit. But for somebody who's blocked, I've definitely found in my practice that going back through their Uranus opposition and understanding what they did or didn't do and comprehending better what was happening to them actually can help them figure out what to do at the point of this spiritual crisis, you know.
Mm.
And the
So,
energy, sometimes what will happen is the energy was blocked and then it rises at Chiron return. And sometimes people have the same kind of freak out. Um, But the most common situation is that some movement and change happens with Uranus opposition. There's some conflict and resolution that goes on at that point. And so for most people, Chiron return is really kind of a special time. And it
Mm,
comes when we're 50 to 51 years old.
mm. I would think that another thing that could happen at that midlife crisis, if you're not aware of what's going on, is that you would distract yourself out of it, that you
Yes.
would just not want to deal with it. And so you're really busy, quote unquote, with your children, with, life, and you miss it by distraction. And that's the setup for in the age around, like you're saying, the
Yeah,
Chiron.
so you take like a successful businessman who just simply works his butt off all the way through his 40s and justifiably so, raising the family, taking care of the kids or whatever. Then he's going to have big spiritual needs when he's 50, 51 years old. Because you can't, once you hit the spiritual level of these issues, you can't distract yourself as easily. There has to be meaning in life. And this is the point where a lot of people are going to have trouble with addictions if they don't just start allowing themselves to grow and change.
Mm.
Some people do.
So, Barbara, would you say that the Saturn return, which is the thing that happens between age 28 to
29,
30-ish,
29.
20, yeah, is more a crisis on the physical level, meaning I don't mean people get sick, but to do with the physical aspects of life, like your job, your whether or not you're going to have children,
Yeah.
the partner you're going to marry, like kind of those more tangible things. And
Yeah.
then the midlife crisis or the Uranus opposition is more emotional.
Mhm.
It's more of an emotional crisis. And then that Chiron is where we get to the spiritual, like you were just saying.
Right. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah, you described it perfectly.
Oh, good.
And I'll just add that at Saturn return, age 29 to 30, I found that about 95% of my clients did their Saturn return. They got a divorce, they got married, they had a kid, they got a new job, whatever, new career. Almost everybody does that one because it's just that physical plane level of growth starts when you're young and builds and builds and builds. And then finally it comes to a crisis and resolution point. Then I found more like my estimate would be probably when I first was practicing astrology back in the 80s, about 20, maybe 30% of people were really changing with Uranus opposition. I think it's much bigger. I think it's much bigger now. I think it's one of the signs of growth and development that's happening to all of us. So I think most, maybe half or more do go through an emotional resolution, which means that whatever is missing in your emotional life and background and marriage and life and all there, maybe it's something to do with your parents. Whatever that is, anything you can do at midlife crisis to resolve some of those emotional issues is extremely helpful and
Mm,
important.
mm. And is the rising of Kundalini, is it always obvious, or do some people have a more subtle experience? Like you were talking about feeling like you were shaking all the time and you were a living earthquake.
Yeah.
But does it always feel like, is it always that intense for people, or is there variation on how you feel it?
There is a variation, but most people at least feel some heat in their body, some sense of anxiety, and often a lot of fluttering in their body. That's the mild level of it. I've found very few people who didn't feel quite a bit when Uranus opposition came along, quite
Mhm,
a bit.
mhm,
And in my case, the reason I was having an earthquake is Saturn is conjunct Uranus in my chart. And so I've got that whole Saturn Uranus resolution issue right in my birth chart. And
mhm,
so for those of us who were born in 1942 through 1944, we've all got that, and it's been difficult for us in varying degrees. But we're
mhm.
also kind of masters of the issue because we've had to learn.
Right. Most of the time you hear about Kundalini, there is some sort of sexual connotation to it. So how does this manifest for people is their sex drive is heightened, or how does that play into it?
Your sex drive is definitely heightened. And therefore, if you don't have that whole issue together, if you don't have a way of expressing yourself sexually in a fairly safe and consistent way, it can be pretty difficult, and it can create some problems. And so another thing I say in the book is that if you have a great life partner and you've been very happy and you've tried to make it all the way through, if there is an affair during that period, it should be forgiven if possible.
Oh,
Because most people really don't want to do, most people will have an affair at that point just out of utter desperation, and not because they don't love their partner, or not because they don't want to stay with their partner. They just, people get desperate,
wow.
especially in Western cultures.
Right. And they
Yeah,
have all this energy moving through them. They don't, and especially if they're with someone who they can't talk about it. They
yeah,
can't talk about what's happening without the other person feeling threatened. It's like they need an outlet for that, is what
yeah,
you're saying.
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah.
And have you had that have you had that happen with clients where you saw that someone was unfaithful, quote unquote, and the person
Oh yeah,
uh
I've had plenty of it, but I'll tell a story about and I'm not, by the way, I'm not a practicing astrologer now, but I still, of course, am there for friends and people in the family and all of
you
that.
mean you don't do readings anymore for
I'm not
people?
doing readings anymore just
Right.
because of the sheer amount of work that I'm doing with books.
Right.
But one of my clients, how did it start? This was a client who was really had a lot of difficulty expressing herself sexually. And even though she had a couple of kids and was a single mom and all that, she hadn't had sex by the time her Uranus opposition came along for about like maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years, something like that. And so when Uranus opposition happened, she went out and went online to find somebody to have sex with, and she ended up getting involved with a super dominant male type, that kind of person, kind of like 50 Shades of Gray.
Hmm.
And the only problem with that was it's not really what she wanted to be and what she wanted to do. And
Hmm.
so she just went through holy hell before she realized that she had to get right out of it and find another way to deal with that energy. But she couldn't help herself. That's how intense this can be.
Hmm.
You really have to be understanding.
And so when people are feeling this, what you're saying is it's this energy that's rising. You do need to have a healthy, safe sexual outlet for it.
Yeah.
But also there's something coming in where you're needing to actually take your power, like, especially for the women. This is what I heard you say. Take your power and find your voice and speak your truth. And so it seems like it could get blocked at the sexual too. Like if you think it's only about what's happening sexually and you don't realize there's this other process that's wanting to happen,
Yeah.
then you could get stuck in one of those positions like you just described with that woman.
Yeah. And then she was certainly showing all the signs of her biggest blockage being in her sacral chakra, being in her root chakra. And
Mm-hmm.
so if the block is in the root chakra, which it is more so for women usually than men, it's really tough breaking through that. And so as that energy really hits that chakra, so people who do yoga have learned about the sexual aspects of Kundalini. Because there, for instance, we went through a whole thing in North America in the 60s and 70s and 80s with women being abused by gurus, because women are dealing with raising energy and they're tremendously turned on by the Kundalini energy, and then they're tricked into expressing it sexually. And sexual expression, of course, should only occur when it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Wow. So it's almost like they're primed for that kind of
yeah.
abuse in that way because they're open, they're vulnerable, they have all this sexual energy running. So
And
yeah.
then one of the themes of astrology and Kundalini is I'm not in favor of raising Kundalini intentionally.
Ah,
Um,
yes.
but-
Oh, I'm so glad you
yeah,
brought this up.
yeah, that's
Yes.
right.
Let's
And in
talk about
fact, that was another thing that inspired me to write the book, is that once I realized that the natural time for it to rise is with midlife crisis, then I started to take a closer look at some of the things I saw going on in Eastern meditation groups. And I won't mention any specific groups. I even wrote a novel about it called California Bust. But the Pleiadians instructed me to throw it in the trash, and so I did. And it was
Oh,
about one of the big gurus who was abusing women. And
whoa.
so there, and this business of going after really young girls, like somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, and some of the kinds of abusive tendencies that men can exhibit. Well, if you combine those kinds of issues and tendencies with people raising Kundalini intentionally with tantric breathing and tantric yoga and all that, I don't think it's a good idea at all. And I've been counseling people for 30 years to not go off and do Kundalini yoga and all that stuff when you're young. But then if you look closely at the Indian sacred traditions, and I mean India of India, the advice has always been in the spiritual traditions, the advanced spiritual traditions, that people should raise their family, deal with the ordinary things of life until they're around 40. And then the time to become more spiritual and raise energy is after sometime after 40. So if you
Mm,
look closely, those traditions have it right in their tradition. And
mm.
these yogis who were turning women on when they were too young were really creating spiritual emergency in these girls, and then also in some cases abusing them. So I
Wow.
think that if you're going to do yoga, and I've been doing yoga for 40 years now, and I still do yoga regularly. Yoga to me is just fundamental to health. But tantric yoga is another issue to look at for people but then once you hit Uranus opposition and you resolve some of the chakra blocks and you start to advance spiritually, then Kundalini yoga and tantric yoga is fabulous for people. It's rejuvenating. It helps with to continue to be healthy and young. You know.
This is just essential information for people.
Yeah.
These lifetime transits that we all go through, it just shows that there's a natural progression already built into the cycle of life. And when we try to force it too early, like what you're talking about, where people are, actively working with Kundalini energy and wanting to rise it
Mhm.
up, which is a lot of the practice, right? That it actually can be dangerous for you to
Yeah.
do that too early. And that we if we wait until we're matured enough, I keep thinking of like fruit on a tree. Like if you pull it off before it's ripe, it's not good. But if you wait and you're patient and you wait until it's ripe, then it's perfect. It sounds like we're ripe at that time. And because we don't understand what's happening, we experience it oftentimes as a crisis, but it's actually just a natural time of life. And if we can work with it very mindfully and consciously, then it's a beautiful opening, which then sets us up for the next part of life to have an even bigger spiritual opening in our 50s.
Mhm. That's right. So the advice on tantric yogic practices reverses if you think about it at midlife crisis. And so that midlife crisis and Uranus opposition is the time to go out and do yoga and tantric yoga and these kinds of spiritual practices, because this energy is wonderful. It's rejuvenating. It's good for our health. It's definitely very, very good for our minds to work with this energy. And so it's just like, unfortunately, when the Eastern traditions transferred over to the West, this part of it was missed as far as I could see, which is too bad.
Well, I can see it's very sexy, and
Right.
I can see how it got globbed onto and it's like, oh, let's promote this aspect of it because it, helps people with their sex lives and it helps make things more juicy and without the astrological context and without the life cycle context, it's again being misused, abused, and potentially dangerous. Something that could be really good is then just it's out of context.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah.
And another thing I'd like to say is that one of the things I learned while writing the book and then continuing to research the book is there can be a lot of physical problems at midlife crisis. A lot of women have a lot of throat chakra problems, and they say their necks are stiff. It's kind of like a wry neck
Mm.
symptom. And men, of course, have a lot of heart systems, and heart attacks do go up dramatically during Uranus opposition. They're like 4 times more likely to have a heart attack, which is why I kept sending people for a physical before I would even work on the issue. So since this can be a killer, basically, to be truthful, it's really smart for people to find out about this. And
Mm.
I've had a couple of doctors who actually knew about Kundalini energy, which was wonderful. I would very shyly say, "Have you heard about Kundalini energy?" And they'd go, "Yeah." And I,
That's
because
great. I love
yeah, I
that.
had another big Kundalini rising about maybe 5 or 6 years ago that
Wow.
felt like, yeah, it felt like a heart attack. And I actually went to the emergency room, which I basically just never do, and had an EKG. And it was just energy. And so this can happen at any time. Anytime anybody has any kind of symptoms like that, keep that in mind. A lot of what goes on is actually energy and not really physiological. But
Wow.
you got to check it out with anything that has to do with circulatory system.
Was there anything astrological that was an impetus for
Yeah,
that?
yeah, and of course I wasn't watching. I got a major Uranus transit. I forget what it was now, but bam.
Wow. Wow. I love the forward to the book, or the preface. There were doctors that you talked to, or that have quotes in the actual book too,
Mhm.
right? In the beginning, kind of validating and verifying a lot of what
Well,
you
the introduction to this book is unbelievable by
say.
Richard Gerber, the author of Vibrational Medicine,
Yeah.
which is his analysis of energy and medicine. It's just that is such a stunner. And unfortunately, Richard, who was a close friend, died about 15 years ago. We lost him when he was young, and he was one of the great, brilliant lights of the New Age movement. So
Mm.
fortunately, that he did get vibrational medicine out, and it's very popular. And then fortunately, that introduction is there, plus other things that he's written.
Yeah, well, my highlighter was very active as I was going through this book. I highly recommend any of you who are interested to check this out. At this point, I don't know how we can't have this in our library, if not for our own midlife crisis, but for our children, for our friends, for people around us, just to know what's happening at that time. It can be, I can see, yeah, I'm at the tail end of it.
Hmm.
Um, and it's definitely it's been so big in my life. I mean, I did the divorce and I did all those things. I didn't know what was happening, but I definitely know that I've been intuitively led to work with a lot of these aspects of myself through it, through yoga, through a lot of different kinds of practices. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, so I'm so grateful to have this information now and to be able to help other people that are going through these periods of time.
And a lot of therapists use it. A lot of therapists have learned to watch out for whether somebody's around 29 or 30, or whether they're in their early 40s, or whether they're 50. A lot of therapists are using this. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Barbara, thank you so much. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you'd like to add to the discussion before we close out?
I don't think so. And it's just always great to talk to you. And I know that you're at the end of yours. My daughter is right in the middle of hers right now. So I'm going through it with my daughter. And she's
Yeah.
not the woman that I described. The woman I described as a European friend. But
Yeah.
Liz, for my daughter Liz, she's just been like half crazy. But she knows what's going on. She's
Yeah.
handling her life very well. And she's doing the right things because you just simply got to go through it.
Yeah. There's another cycle, and I can't remember what it is that you describe in the book that has to do with Saturn,
Mhm.
where there's a chart where we can see where we're at in that overarching
Yeah.
cycle.
Yeah.
And that was also fascinating. I mean, there's so much in this book.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a fascinating issue. That's another chapter I put in the book, because a major astrology magazine refused to publish it and said it was bad astrology. And that chapter is some of the best astrology for the ordinary person. This is a book to learn about astrology. Some people you have learned about astrology just from reading this.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's lots of instruction in there. I love your description of the houses. I mean, there's really amazing, and you write so accessibly. Like, this is a great book for beginners, or people that are newer to astrology and wanting to understand what it actually even is.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely
Thank you. I
helpful.
agree. And only because I probably promoted this book more than anything I've ever written, just because I've saved lives with this book,
Mm, mm,
and that's what I'm here for.
yeah,
Yeah.
powerful,
And
powerful. Barbara,
help
thank
create
you.
more happiness. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much for being here with us. I can't wait to have you back on the show
I'll be
to talk
back.
about I mean, the trilogy that Barbara has written is also very, very amazing. If you want to check that out, it's called Revelations is the overarching name for the entire trilogy, but she's been writing it for the last 10 years. And it's taking a look at what's actually happening right now. Like it's a very real-time trilogy that she was writing as events have been unfolding over the last 10 years. And it's fascinating. And I feel like one of the things that you do so well is you bring up topics in a fictional story that make some of these metaphysical and esoteric things that are happening right now easier to understand because it's in a story. You know, you're learning about characters, and these things are unfolding as you're learning about their lives. And it's really amazing what you've done. I'm so grateful. It's such a contribution. And I highly recommend any of you who haven't tuned into Barbara's trilogy to do that yet. And I know the third book is coming out like any day now, right?
Yeah, any day. Yeah.
All right.
A joy.
Yeah. And yes, exactly. So thank you everybody for being here. Thank you for tuning into this episode. If you're interested in knowing where you're at in these cycles, if you are interested in knowing what is coming for you in your transits and your cycles that are coming next, I highly recommend that you check out something that we have that is brand new. And these are astrological reports. So we have two different reports. One is a character and destiny report, and the other one is a year ahead report. So these are going to give you insights into your birth chart. So you'll be able to see when your Uranus oppositions are happening, and you'll be able to check out Barbara's book and compare and contrast when she has her charts that help you figure out when your opposition's happening. But then also you get your year ahead transits. So those are available now at astrologyhub.com/astrological-reports. That's astrologyhub.com/astrological-reports. So check those out. And we'll put those links in the description as well as the links to Barbara's books. So thank you again, Barbara. It's been so much fun.
Thank you.
Can't wait to talk to you again soon. And take care, everybody. And can't wait to see you on the next episode.